Alright folks, this is Sultan. When a dictator who has already lost at least 400,000 of his soldiers then threatens nuclear war, it's clear he's scared, he's losing, because he knows he cannot win conventionally. Putin's propaganda state TV has been airing simulations of how a nuclear attack on London would look like. Check it out.
Given the population density in central London, the initial death toll could exceed 250,000 people and around 600,000 injured.
So first of all, to all those people in the West who have a soft spot for Putin, what do you think now? I'm sure a lot of you will say, oh, no, I admit Putin is crazy, but why should we get involved and provoke Putin into a war that isn't ours to begin with? Okay, let's explore that. If the United States had followed the same logic, they shouldn't have come to Britain's rescue in the Second World War. Anyway, today the official narrative is that Ukraine wants to be a free, Western-style democracy and doesn't want to be a Russia's satellite state. And Ukraine is not alone. The fact that almost all former Soviet satellite states have joined the EU or NATO proves that life is better under the West. So any country that wants to be free from tyranny deserves the support of the free world. Belarus, at least under its current dictator's leadership, doesn't want to be in the Western camp. So if Putin decides to invade Belarus tomorrow, we won't be demanding a Western intervention. Unless, of course, the Belarusians themselves first overthrow Europe's last dictator, Lukashenko. Then we have a moral obligation to support freedom-loving Belarusians as well. Putin knows he cannot win this war against Ukraine conventionally. So to compensate, he tries to scare ordinary Western people into thinking that if he's losing, he'll press the nuclear button. He's counting on you to get scared, withdraw support for Ukraine, and thus abandon Western ideals.
И при угрозе территориальной целостности нашей страны для защиты России и нашего народа это не блеф.
But Putin can't go to nuclear war with the West either. Putin has directly mentioned nukes at least twice, but his lackeys like Lavrov and Dmitry Medvedev, along with many others on Russian propaganda TV channels, have threatened nuclear war against the West many times. This is what we call nuclear sabre-rattling. Let me give you a brief rundown of how many times Putin threatened nuclear war, and each time it turned out to be an empty threat. First, they said if we support Ukraine in any way, there could be a nuclear war. Then we gave Ukraine anti-tank missiles like the Javelin. Nothing happened. Next, we gave them HIMARS, which absolutely devastated Russian troops. Again, no nuclear attack. Putin, instead of pressing the nuclear button, just pulled out his troops out of HIMARS' range. Then he said don't give tanks or armored vehicles to Ukraine. But we did, in the form of British Challenger, German Leopard and American M1 Abrams tanks. And we also chipped in some Bradley vehicles too. Nothing happened. He got so frustrated that his state propaganda channel again played a simulation showing how the UK would be devastated by a Russian nuclear strike. Have a look at this video from 2 years ago.
Остров столь мал, что лишь одной ракеты «Sultan» достаточно, чтобы его утопить раз и навсегда.
But it didn't matter. Western leaders knew these were just empty threats from a scared dictator. So then we gave F-16s to Ukraine. Still, nothing happened. Then he said don't use Western missiles to target Russian territory. The US allowed Ukraine to attack Russian military targets in Donbass and Crimea, which Russia considers its own territory. And again, nothing happened. And then the mother of all red lines was crossed when the Ukrainians went into Russia and captured more than 1,200 square kilometers of Russian territory in Kursk. Nothing happened. Now Putin is saying that Ukrainians can invade Russia, but if they use Western weapons to do so, there will be a nuclear war. The point is, Putin keeps moving his red lines, but there's no nuclear attack. To make Western leaders take his threats more seriously, he recently updated his nuclear doctrine, as if there ever was a nuclear doctrine under Putin. Putin is a czar. He can violate his own doctrine anytime he wants. Anyway, now he says that if Mother Russia is under attack, all options are on the table, including nuclear strikes. Recently, he boasted that Russia's nuclear triad is the best in the world, as if it's not as unreliable as everything else Russian. Experts believe that even if he tried to launch all his nuclear missiles at once, half of them would blow up at the point of origin. Why do experts believe that? Well, you don't have to look far. You just have to look at Russian weaponry in Ukraine. You look at the Russian army's performance in Ukraine. I'm sorry to say, it's a third-rate army. It can't fight NATO in a conventional war. He knows that. He can't even win in Ukraine with minimal Western support, marred with restrictions. It's not even Ukraine. Israel just destroyed an arms depot in a Russian base in Syria because those weapons were going to Hezbollah. I'm sure you heard about it, but just once though. Putin is not talking about it because it's embarrassing for him. Israel has attacked one of its bases and he can't do anything. The US is not talking about it because they are scared of Putin's nuclear sabre-rattling. And lastly, even Israel is not talking about it because Israel's hands are full. I really hope that once Israel destroys Hezbollah and even put this Islamic regime on leash, Israel comes out fully in support of Ukraine. Israel has not given Ukraine the support it deserves. So, we all know Putin's red lines are just there to scare Western leaders and, more importantly, you, the ordinary public. That's his strategy. Now, that's not to say there is no chance of a full-scale nuclear war. I believe that if Putin thinks he's losing the war and his life is in danger, then he might be tempted to use nuclear weapons. Even then, it's highly unlikely because people within his regime who don't want to commit this collective suicide may try to overthrow him to stop a nuclear launch. They might even assassinate him. This is why he's put all his eggs in one basket. This is life and death for Putin. There could potentially be a coup if he loses. He's isolated in the world, with 2 million Russians having fled the country and around 400,000 Russians killed or maimed.
Разрешите представиться. Мой позывной Азит. Я Кремер Эдгар Назимович. Мы военнослужащие штурмовой роты 19-го танкового полка 25-й армии. В данный момент мы занимаем круговую оборону. По ту сторону пидорасы, которые долбят по нам день и ночь. А по ту сторону пидорасы наши же, которые хотят нас всех обнулить. По той простой причине, что мы отказываемся выполнять их тупые, необдуманные, пьяные приказы. Наш командир батальона Радченко Сергей Сергеевич, позывной «Атлас», несколько дней назад начал обнулять наших бойцов. В прямом смысле слова совершать самосуд, убивать наших людей вместе со своим товарищем, который относится к группе В, и убивает пацанов за то, что они отказываются идти вперед. По той причине, потому что теряют каждый заход 90% личного состава. В данный момент нас осталось мало, и мы находимся под угрозой. Под угрозой наших же командиров.
The situation in Russia is dire, and Putin knows it. This is actually one of America's biggest fears. They don't want Putin overthrown because that could lead to civil war in Russia. Local generals vying for power could end up with nuclear weapons, and no one knows who'd control them. That's an absolute nightmare scenario. So while America wants Putin to lose the war, they don't necessarily want him overthrown. Better the devil you know than the one you don't. That's where Zelensky's peace plan comes in. Zelensky has created this peace plan to show to Trump and Biden that the only way to bring Putin to the negotiating table is to make him believe that he will lose the war and consequently his power and possibly his life. If Putin is convinced of this, that's when he'll negotiate. How will this happen? The details are in Zelensky's plan, but the key is to keep arming Ukraine so they can be in a stronger position when the two parties sit down for negotiations. Ukraine can't get caught in a war of attrition because at some point they will run out of soldiers. Putin can throw another 200,000 people into the meat grinder because he has an endless supply of soldiers from non-ethnic Russian areas. But he won't draft from Moscow or St. Petersburg because if body bags start coming back there will be a political cost. However, Putin has ordered his military to boost their numbers by 180,000 soldiers, but he hasn't started the mobilization yet because he knows it could trigger something that might jeopardize his hold on power. So my point is this: we need to support Ukraine so they can win and restore the international rules-based order. We need to give them more arms because there's no other way. And this is why Trump is absolutely wrong on this issue. Zelensky even offered to meet Trump, which Trump initially rejected, but eventually met him at Trump Tower. I don't know why Trump is simping for Putin. I don't think he's in Putin's pocket, but I think he's signaling to Putin that he'll be good for his war in Ukraine. So if possible, help him on social media. But if you don't want to go that far, I'll simply say that Trump is wrong on Ukraine, and those who support him on that are also wrong. Let me show you this clip where Trump says Zelensky is the greatest salesman. Every time he comes, he gets $60 billion.
Every time he comes to our country, he walks away with $60 billion.
What is he talking about? Zelensky doesn't get that money for himself. America sends old weapons to Ukraine and then replenishes its own stock with newer ones. All the M1 Abrams, HIMARS and Bradleys are old stock. The US then replenishes its inventory with new weapons, and guess who's getting the money? America. It's American workers who benefit from this military aid. Zelensky's people are dying in defense of their country the same way Americans would die to protect theirs. This anti-Ukraine propaganda is farcical. The idea that Zelensky is pocketing the money is ridiculous. That's akin to saying Churchill pocketed America's aid in the Second World War. He's fighting a war that was imposed on him by a dictator who dreams of leaving a mark on history greater than any czars. Lastly, Putin's nuclear sabre-rattling is just bluff and bluster because his economy is teetering on the edge of collapse, and the only countries keeping him afloat are India and China, but only just. Russian oil costs more than Saudi oil to extract, but due to international sanctions and price capping, the Indians and Chinese are buying cheap Russian oil at break-even cost. This is why Gazprom just reported a $7 billion loss for the first time in 20 years. So if India and China pull out, the Russian economy will collapse overnight, and Putin knows this. This gives both India and China massive leverage over India. And let me tell you, both Xi Jinping and PM Modi have strongly warned Putin against any nuclear escalation. So while Putin might keep instilling fear in ordinary Westerners like you of a nuclear war, it is highly unlikely that he'll actually go to a nuclear war with the West. Yes, we would all lose. Our entire planetary civilization would come to its knees, but Russia would be annihilated, far worse than the free world. Kursk has already been liberated by Ukrainians. Ukrainians are destroying Russian ammunition depots left, right and center with their homegrown drones. And the last thing Putin wants is for the West to give Zelensky permission to use storm shadows and ATACMS, which would further weaken Russia. Do you really think he's going to drop a nuke on London or Paris or Berlin if Ukraine throws an ATACMS at a Russian military base inside Russia? Of course not. There are still many steps to be taken before the war truly escalates to nuclear conflict. So I join Ben Hodges, Hamish de Bretton-Gordon and David Petraeus in calling Putin's nuclear threats just empty threats. So if you want to support democracy, you need to support Ukraine. If you think Putin annexing Ukrainian territory will have no impact on your cushy lives in Western Europe, you're wrong. The survival of Ukraine ensures the survival of democracies and the international rules-based order, and consequently, all of us. Slava Ukraini. If you'd like to support my work, you can become my patron by going to patreon.com/Sultan, or you can simply buy me a coffee.